Okay, so today I'm looking at the theme of exile and inclusion in Camus, and specifically his collection of 6 short stories called Exile and the Kingdom, which I recently read. The sort of plan I have is to kind of give you an introduction to Camus, tell you a little bit about his background. Some of you might already know some of this, but I'm just going to assume that nobody knows anything. So I'll tell you a little bit about Camus, also about his sort of philosophy or the contributions that he made to philosophy. And then what I'd like to do is I've got some quotes or some excerpts from 2 of the stories, and I'd like us to kind of maybe work as small groups, or maybe we could work as a class, depending on what works, and just try to kind of dissect these quotes a bit and see if we can find any relation between these and between the overall theme of the course. So we'll try it, but I don't know if it will work. Okay, so just to give you a bit of background on Camus. So he was born in 1913, so just before the start of the First World War, in a small coastal village in Algeria. And he was from a Pied Noir family. So I think some of you are studying Derrida, so you're probably aware of this sort of culture or this term. Pied Noir translates as Blackfoot. It's a sort of derogatory term that is used to describe a variety of different immigrants who migrated to Northern Africa. Northern Africa was French at the time, so it was colonized by France. And they usually came from quite meager circumstances. So for example, Camus' father was a very poor agricultural worker who died in the First World War, and his mother was an illiterate house cleaner. So that's the sort of family that he was born into. He was, like many sort of French Algerian writers at the time, he was a communist. And he joined in 1935, and he was especially interested in communism that dealt with the sort of issues of inequality between, as he saw, the native Algerians that he existed alongside, and the French Pied Noir communities that existed or that lived in Algeria. And there was quite a significant socioeconomic sense of inequality between those 2 sort of cultural groups. However, later in his life, he became quite disenchanted with communism, and he made this most explicit in his book, The Rebel. And when he released this book, he really isolated himself quite a lot from his literary counterparts. So other people who were writing at the time, who were quite staunch communists. Remember, this was just after the Second World War, so it was seen as quite an important thing that people felt that they had to believe in. So when he was kind of criticizing this, he really did isolate himself quite a lot. So that's one sort of notable aspect, I think, of Camus, which is quite important to understand his writings and to understand what I'll hopefully talk about. But also what's interesting is that he was very silent on the French-Algerian War. So this was quite a bloody and violent conflict between Algeria and France. France had colonized Algeria. Algeria then became independent, and this war sort of happened around the 1950s, 1960s. And he was very non-partisan. He didn't want to choose sides in the war. His sort of literary counterparts, who were French, were very much in favor of the Algerian independence, and Camus was very sympathetic towards Algerian independence, but he also had a strong association with the French that were still living there, many of whom became sort of exiled from their French community. Am I okay? Or a bit slower, sorry.
Don't worry about the times.
Okay, sorry. I'm trying to get through everything. So he won the Nobel Prize in 1957, and he talks a little bit about this sort of inner turmoil that he had because he couldn't quite choose sides in the French-Algerian War. So this is him with Sartre, who you know I'm studying. They were very good friends for a long time, up until he sort of separated himself from communism, and this was kind of the cause of a rift between them. But in terms of Camus' philosophy, he's often labeled as an existentialist, and it's definitely very influential in his work. But he did reject this label himself. But like sort of existentialism, French existentialism at the time, one of his main motivations for writing was to fight nihilism, and he was very influenced by Nietzsche actually in terms of this, and he saw that nihilism was becoming the sort of defining feature of his generation. And I'd like to show you a quote. This is from his Nobel Prize speech. And this is sort of where he sums up the sort of generation that he was writing in, which he saw as falling into the sort of traps of nihilism. So these men who were born at the beginning of the First World War, who were 20 when Hitler came to power, and the first revolutionary trials were beginning, who were then confronted with, as a completion of their education, with the Spanish Civil War, the Second World War, the world of concentration camps, a Europe of torture and prisons. These men must today rear their sons and create their works in a world threatened by nuclear destruction. Nobody, I think, can ask them to be optimists. And I even think that we should understand, without ceasing to fight it, the error of those who, in an excess of despair, have asserted their right to dishonor and have rushed into the nihilism of the era. But the fact remains that most of us in my country and in Europe have refused this nihilism and have engaged upon a quest for legitimacy. They have had to forge for themselves an art of living in times of catastrophe in order to be born a second time and to fight openly against the instinct of death at work in our history. So this is kind of what he saw as I mentioned, the sort of nihilistic defining feature of his generation that we need to sort of fight against, or he was trying to sort of fight against. And this ties in very well with his main sort of philosophical contribution, which is known as absurdism. He didn't invent this term, but he sort of elucidated it quite clearly in a lot of his works. And absurdism is this idea that the world itself is silent, it's kind of unknowable, it's irreducible, it doesn't give us anything, it doesn't endow us with any sense of meaning. But we are constantly trying to find meaning in the world. And at one point in our lives, for many of us, we sort of start to feel that, yes, the world is not actually giving me any sense of meaning. It's all sort of meaningless. And we become very despaired. And that can lead to a very sort of nihilistic viewpoint. So Camus doesn't want to deny this sense of meaninglessness, but at the same time, he thinks that we should try to revolt against it. So that was kind of what he was talking about in a lot of his works. So we need to constantly try to struggle against this nihilism that we often face when we come face to face with the sort of absurdity of the world. Even if we think that overcoming this sense is not possible, we should continually struggle nevertheless. Am I still talking too fast?
It's okay.
No? Okay. A bit slower. Okay. Okay, sorry.
Can I ask something?
Yes?
We should have asked this earlier. Do you know what nihilism means? I know some of you do. Nihilism. Yes? Okay. Sorry.
No, that's fine. And then just to give you an example, this is some of his main works. If you're interested, he talks about absurdism in The Myth of Sisyphus. This is kind of his main work, but also in a number of his novels, he also writes about this. And you can see probably in the texts that I've given you that he also alludes to this idea of absurdism as well, quite clearly. Okay, so the sense of exile is very, very strong in Camus, and some of his biographers have referred to him as being doubly exiled. So in one sense, he was a pied noir, so he was a third-generation immigrant in Algeria. On the one hand, he didn't feel that he quite belonged to Algeria because he was part of the French community there. He could see the kind of difference between the two communities, the sort of inequality between the two communities. So he didn't feel like he belonged in Algeria that much. But at the same time, he didn't feel that he belonged to the French sort of, or France, or the country of his heritage either. So in one sense, he was doubly exiled there. But he was also exiled in a certain sense as an artist as well. Not only in terms of, rejecting communism and becoming kind of isolated from his literary counterparts, but he also talks a lot about having many different commitments. So he was a father, he was married, not a very good husband, as you might know. But he felt that he had to be committed to his family, but he also had to be committed to his work as an artist, which often involved kind of writing in solitude away from other people. So he had these kind of conflicting commitments in that sense as well. And also in terms of feeling as if he had to take sides, especially in the French-Algerian conflict. And this was a sort of pressure that he always felt he was under, in a sense. And this is just another quote. I won't read it, but this is how he sort of describes the role of the artist and how this might conflict with other commitments that we often have. Okay, so the excerpts that we're looking at today are from a collection of short stories that he wrote in 1957. There are 6 short stories, but I'm just going to look at 2 today. The first one is called The Adulterous Woman. I suspect that nobody has read it. I don't know if anyone has. No, okay. So I'm just going to really very basically explain what the story is about. It's not actually much of a story. It's more of a description of the main character, Janine, and how she sort of feels. Janine, like Camus, is a Pierre Noir in Algeria, so she's a French immigrant in Algeria. Throughout the story, there's a very strong sense of nostalgia. She finds herself kind of old, kind of unattractive, and she's constantly thinking back to her youth when she was more attractive. She's in a marriage that she's not entirely happy about. Her husband is quite hostile to the native Algerians, and she sort of feels uncomfortable with him. And for that reason, for both of those reasons, she feels quite lost. And this is sort of symbolized in the fact that in the story, her and her husband are traveling through Algeria and they're selling fabrics. So they're in these very, very small villages that are very isolated from each other. So she has this sort of sense of loss, and that's very strong in the story, and also a sense of isolation. And towards the end of the story, she suddenly has this kind of unexplainable urge. She runs to the top of a fort and she looks out across the desert. And I don't know if any of you have ever been in a desert before, but what's really remarkable, and I wish I put a picture up actually, is that because there are no lights, the stars in the sky are very vivid and very clear. So you can imagine she's standing at the top of a fort, she's looking out. The sky looks like it's almost weighing down on you, and the desert she can see for thousands of kilometers ahead of her. And so she starts to get this sort of absurd sense of her feeling very isolated, very lost in the world. And she notices some camels and some nomadic people. She can see them in the distance. She starts to feel a kind of connection with them, this sense of homelessness that they sort of embody. And so she starts to kind of feel a sort of association with them. So that's that sort of, that's the first story. And then the second story is a bit more famous, I think. The French is L'hôte, okay? I don't speak French. And it can be translated as the guest or the host, which I think was intentional. And it tells the story of a guy called Daru. Daru is also, like Camus, a Pierre Noir. So he's a French in Algeria. He's a school teacher. And he's very non-partisan. He doesn't want to take sides in the French-Algerian War. One day he's in the schoolhouse, and a local French guard comes to his house with a prisoner, an Arab prisoner, so a native Algerian prisoner who has just killed somebody very violently. This is around the time of the start of the conflict between France and Algeria, Algeria fighting for independence. And the guard tells Daru that he has to take the prisoner to a nearby village where he'll be arrested and tried for his crimes. And at first Daru refuses. He says, I don't want to be involved. This is not my task. And the guard gets very, very offended. And he says, you have to take sides. You either take the prisoner to the local village, and it's in a way, taking sides with the French, or you let him escape and you are in effect taking sides with the Algerians. So there's this very strong sense of having to take sides. So Daru ends up staying with the prisoner for a few days, I think, and shares a meal with the prisoner. He's trying to think about what to do. He doesn't know what to do. I won't tell you what happens in the end, but I think it's on the sheet. But I don't want to ruin the story for you. So throughout the story is this feeling of he's not sure what he needs to do. He's kind of praying that the prisoner escapes so that he doesn't have to make this decision. So what he does is he takes the prisoner to a crossroads and he tells the prisoner, you need to decide. If you go this way, you go to the village and you'll be arrested. If you go this way, you'll go to your village and you can go free. And then he kind of lets the prisoner decide which way he wants to go. This has actually been made into a movie quite recently, 2014. It's a much extended version. It's called Far From Men. You might like to watch it, I'm not sure. Okay, so how am I for time? Am I?
10 more minutes, and then
okay.
And then 15 minutes discussion.
Okay, so I'm going to try to finish and then we'll have a longer discussion, I think. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is I'd like to kind of think about two themes that I think are quite strong in both of the stories and also in the quotes that I've selected. So just some guiding questions I think we can think about as we're looking at these quotes. Of course, if you think of other things to talk about, that's absolutely fine. So for example, Camus is a writer, so he's a very good writer, I think, but it's not always exactly clear what he's saying. So I think the first thing you need to think about is what's actually happening in the scenes. Can you think about what's happening in the scenes? And can you think about how the character might be feeling in this scene? That's sort of the first thing we might think about. And also, how do you think these quotes relate to a feeling of exile, which is the main sort of theme of the 6 short stories in the book? And how do you think exile is displayed or demonstrated in these quotes? So there might be different ways that we can think about exile. So in these quotes, how do you think, what kind of understanding of exile is put forth? And then also just thinking about how this relates then to the anxiety of inclusion. And I think it's quite clear that there's an underlying sense of anxiety in each of the quotes with each of the characters. So how might we relate that to the overall theme? And also just maybe we can think about relating this to things that are happening in our own contexts or things that are happening of our age, perhaps. That might be something to think about. But the first sort of theme that I found was very strong in all of the stories was this idea of silence and speech. The word silent is mentioned quite often throughout the different 6 stories, but in different sort of contexts. And this is sometimes characterized as a kind of voicelessness in different ways. So in one of the stories, it's a sort of as a protest. It's workers refusing to speak because they are protesting against the management in their factory. In The Adulterous Wife, it's more of a sense of not being able to find the right words to describe her feeling of loss or describe her feeling of nostalgia. She can't really pinpoint what it is that she wants to say or what it is that she thinks. The Renegade is another story about a madman who has his tongue cut out. We won't go into that, but there's also a more violent kind of voicelessness as well that I think is quite prominent. So just to direct you to some quotes. So the first quote, you might like to just take a couple of minutes to read it and maybe talk about it with the person next to you. And how do you think this might relate to this idea of silence and speech? So this is Janine and the Mute Escort. So it's the first page, first quote. So you might like to think about the questions that I had before as well. Sorry, I'd like to get through a few of the quotes, so that's why I'm stopping you short. But would anybody like to share what they came up with? I'm told that I do, when I teach, I'm very good at picking on people, apparently. So, Jay, do you want to?
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm not sure how the two sections of the quote are they sequential? Are they one after the other?
Not exactly. There's.
Okay, yeah, but it's interesting that this silence that weighs down on her is when it's broken. It's this violent language of a gunshot almost going off, and it's the language of the other that. As Casa kind of pointed out, you know, this is her country, so to speak, but she doesn't understand the language. It's almost like there's this kind of ongoing threat of violence of the other's language. She's weighed down and oppressed by the silence, but when the silence is broken by speech, it's fired off in something that she finds threatening. So I thought that the contrast there, and if you look at the way it's written, it's this kind of languorous. That's a nice word there.
What's it mean?
It means sort of drowsy or sleepy, perhaps has other connotations, but sort of drowsy, swaying in the writing, swayed more than the others with the movement of the vehicle, their silence, their impassiveness. So there's this sort of sense of the heat of the place, and then it kind of breaks with this kind of firing off. I thought that was quite well done. But I can see what you mean about this speech and silence.
Did anyone else want to? Yeah.
Most of the sentences are description of the Arabs, not the description of the Jenny. So I think why the author describes divided the sentence into the description of the Arabs, not the description of her.
Okay.
But I haven't read the other sentences, so from this quotation, I just thought that.
Yeah. Why do you think that might be? So you can answer, or somebody else. Why do you think Camus is sort of focusing on maybe a description of the Arabs rather than... So he doesn't actually ever say Janine is feeling this way. He doesn't put her in this sort of subjective position. It's almost as if something is weighing on her from the outside. So why do you think he does that, maybe? Why does he write it that way? I don't know, by the way. I'm just interested.
It's very much that sense of her.
Yeah, this sense of her sort of looking out into and around the bus, and this is what she experiences, these different ways in which there seems to be no possibility of communication. Whether it's them seeming to be asleep, whether it's the face coverings, whether it's the feet up on the... they've got their feet up, they're silent, so there's all these sort of these different experiences that she has of the sort of impossibility or the lack of communication.
Yeah. And I think, and then that, I guess, what I would say is that leads to a sense of exile then, doesn't it? So she's in the country of her birth, but she's very much exiled from the people who who are sort of the native people who live there. So there's a sense of exile by not sharing the same language, I think, perhaps. I don't know if...
She's exiled in her marriage too, isn't she?
Yes, yes, yeah. Okay, so another quote that kind of deals with this, it's quite long, so I think if we just take the sort of the bold part, this is the scene when she goes to the roof of the fort and she looks out and she kind of encounters the sort of absurdity that Camus often talks about. So again, maybe if you'd like to just take another few minutes to read this and talk to the person next to you, but this is a different kind of silence, I think, maybe.
Can you tell us what absurd means?
Absurd, sorry. So absurd is I can't go back to the slide, but when I say absurd, I guess I mean it in a philosophical way. So Camus sort of didn't invent, but one of his main philosophies was this idea of the absurd. And the absurd is this idea that we are constantly trying to find meaning in the world, but the world is very silent. It doesn't give us any sense of meaning. And so we live in this kind of sense of always searching for something, but never quite receiving anything from what we're searching for. So this is this sort of unsettled feeling. I don't know if that...
Deaf to us.
Yes, the world is, yeah. I'll be teachery and I'll say 1 minute for, no.
So it's number 4.
Yes, sorry, so quote number 4, and just the bold part, I think we can skip the first part because we won't have time, and it continues on the next page as well. I hate stopping discussion, but time is of the essence. Marinette and Nami? You look like you were having a nice discussion.
Not quite. I could because I've been having a very good discussion with Mariette, but the thing is that we didn't have time to discuss.
Ah, okay.
No, I mean as to the earlier one, we did, but
Okay.
So I have nothing to say.
Okay, yeah. I think I was a bit overambitious, maybe, but...
Last quotation in the verse, she...
The first
yes, first quotation. She felt uneasy, surrounded by Arab. But this quotation, the last other voices rising from the Arab town fell suddenly quiet. She is emancipated. Feel relief, relax.
She's maybe awakened, I think.
Yeah.
I think there's a strong sense of her sort of maybe accepting her homelessness or her feeling of not being quite at home. She kind of gets this awakening, maybe, I think, or emancipation. Yeah.
But you say something. Do you want to say?
Did anyone else have something similar or different?
Again, this is the last bit. I think is quite telling when she says, "As the voices rising from Arab towns fell suddenly quiet." So it's as if she can't be herself as long as the Arabs are present. So she's in her country of birth, yet the presence of the Arabs prevent her being herself, which is quite ironic. Because
what do you think her self is? What do you mean
I don't know what her self is, but I think because she is a colonizer, but she can't really be a colonizer because she's probably a third generation. So this is her country. She's born here, but she still is part of the ruling elite, even though she might not be very high in terms of the socioeconomic structure. But she can't be, because she doesn't speak the language, and I don't think she wants to speak the language. And I think that's usually the case with elites or colonizers. After a couple of generations, they don't fully belong in the culture because they haven't really tried to learn the language. And they will always be perceived as colonizers.
I think if we actually, it's really interesting. If you look at the third quote, I'll just read it out. I think this is a very clear example, more so from her husband, but also she partakes in it passively. But he says, he stopped his wife from drinking the water. It's not boiled, have wine. This is a Muslim country, remember, so drinking alcohol was forbidden. She did not like that. The wine made her drowsy. And then there was pork on the menu, again forbidden by the Arabs wouldn't have eaten pork. The Quran forbids it, but the Quran didn't know that well done pork doesn't make people sick. We French, we know how to cook. And then he asks her, what are you thinking about? And Janine says she was thinking of nothing, or perhaps this cook's triumph over the prophets, which I guess is kind of a humorous. And then later on she says, the pork, though well done, and the little wine she had drunk made her somewhat uncomfortable. It doesn't really go into what it is the source of this discomfort, but I think it could partly be to do with not integrating with the culture and actually going against the culture that's there.
Dietary things are really powerful markers of inclusion and exclusion as well.
Yeah.
I want to make one comment, because it seems that she's projecting her personal views onto others. And she used sometimes that words that are a bit of derogative, like the impassiveness, when she look at them. And maybe because she's exiled from that culture, she tends to see them, that behavior, as something negatively. And maybe that people are enjoying themselves very much. Maybe because it doesn't apply to her, she doesn't feel part of that, then she will see that through the lens of the way she feels in regards to that culture. So maybe they are extremely happy, not her.
Yeah, I think that's very clear, and there's a sense of she's misrecognizing the culture because she's exiled from it, either purposefully exiled or not purposely exiled, but she's apart from it. And there's a sense of her misrecognizing the culture and misrecognizing their actions, which she thinks is something else, but it's really just a maybe cultural difference, I think.
Do you think that there have been a space in which she could detach herself for the way she felt and try to understand that culture from the perspective of the other?
Yeah. I think what's difficult is, and I think what Camus maybe found difficult, was not being able to speak the same language for whatever reason. So there was a lack of conversation because there were two cultures living side by side that weren't able to communicate with each other. I think that's part of, perhaps. How am I for time?
Almost over.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but who has questions?
Yes?
It's just that there's a third culture here in the bottom line of the page, really. We've got the Arabs in the town making a noise, which is presented negatively from her experience. But the nomads here, the people who have no home, but make their home in moving, is what she feels attuned to, isn't it? And the phrasing at the bottom, that these people are serving no one, possessing nothing, but serving no one, the destitute and free lords of the strange kingdom. In a sense, it's not a kingdom, it's not a lordship, but they're destitute, which means very poor, they have nothing, but they're also free. So this is very close to what he celebrates elsewhere in this text, isn't it? Okay.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes?
Your theme is exile.
Yes.
EX.
Yes.
Out. EX out. And the theme of this course is anxiety of inclusion. And this morning we talked about this kind of distinction between what is explicit and implicit. If you put emphasis on exile, how would you say those people in a state of exile will find the way back? In other words, the relationship between inside and outside, exile. I don't know what is the opposite of exile, but immigrants?
Integration.
No.
Yeah, maybe integration or...
Integration, would you say along the line of Camus, this person in the second quote you read, he says that she feels being released, liberated.
Yeah.
But
I think it's more that she's awakened to, in my understanding, she's awakened to the fact that she's in exile in the sense that she doesn't belong to, or she doesn't feel like she belongs to either culture. And she's kind of accepting of that now. So she sees the nomadic people, which I think she sees as having a close association with. And these are sort of homeless in a sense. They don't belong anywhere particular. So she's sort of feels that that's how she is herself. She also doesn't belong anywhere. But I think she's coming to sort of accept that, maybe. I don't know.
She wouldn't go anywhere.
Well, she couldn't. And actually this happened with a lot of Pied Noirs after the Algerian independence. Many of them were displaced and many of them went back to France or to the countries of their heritage. And they're characterized as having a very strong sense of nostalgia because these were third, fourth generation immigrants who had never lived in France before. And so were very nostalgic for the sort of homeland that they left. And so they were always in this kind of state of exile, I think. But I wanted to do a bit more, but I know we don't have time, but there was another theme I was going to look at, but we can skip it. But I just wanted to kind of summarize a little bit what I sort of interpreted about this and how I see that it relates to the theme. And so I'm recently quite interested in the philosophy of recognition. I don't know if you know much about it, but I found there's this sense of uprootedness and recognition that's quite strong. So you could understand exile as a kind of uprootedness. So this constant feeling of being uprooted, of not really fitting into a particular category, perhaps. And I think this is why Camus is something that a lot of teenagers quite enjoy, because they're often trying to sort of find their identity and they don't feel like they belong maybe in their family or in a particular social group. So this sense of constant uprootedness, perpetual uprootedness, not belonging to something, which I think is a form of exile in a sense. But I also think this might relate to recognition in terms of how we recognize ourselves as belonging to a particular group or country, and also how we recognize other people as belonging to a particular group. And there is a danger that recognition can lead to something very fixed. So we might recognize the other as having a particular quality, particular features. We have particular expectations of them. This is not just me, this is the society in general might have particular expectations which can kind of fix your identity and fix how you understand yourself. And this is also happening to us at the same time. So society is also doing this to us. So we're constantly struggling against these kinds of fixed ideas that are imposed on us and our identity. So for example, the adulterous woman, she's recognized as a wife, but she doesn't quite know what that means, and she feels exiled from her marriage. She talks about needing to be needed. She needs her husband to need her. That's how she defines her relationship with him. She's also a French woman in Algeria. She's also a woman, so there's all of these kinds of expectations that are placed on her that I think leads to this sense of uprootedness when you feel like that's not really defining who you are accurately or authentically. Daru as well, is he the guest in the story? He's a Frenchman in Algeria. Is he a guest in that country, or is he the host in that country? He's hosting the Arab prisoner who's been brought to him. So there's a strong sense there of which way should we recognize him, as a host or as a guest? Yes?
There's also a third meaning to Leut, and it's hostage.
Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Hostage is someone who is kept by a group, and the group won't release this person until they get some money. Do you know that? What's the word in Japanese? What's the Japanese? Thank you.
Okay. So depending on how we recognize the Arab in the story and the teacher, Daru, do we recognize him as a guest, as a host, as someone who has taken the prisoner hostage, as hostage himself in some sense? That changes how we think of him and his character. So it's very, I think, linked. And I think recognition itself, as I've mentioned, is very closely related to the sense of belonging and where we're supposed to belong. Where do we feel at home? Camus, as I said, is often referred to as doubly exiled. He doesn't feel at home necessarily in his craft as a writer because he's kind of isolated himself from his other sort of literary friends, let's say. He also feels exiled in the sense of being a Frenchman in Algeria, sort of a colonizer in a sense, but a third generation colonizer. So there's this sense of not really belonging anywhere and not really feeling like you have a home. And this is, again, related to uprootedness, which I've already kind of gone through. So that was my feeling of the book, but maybe I'm reading too much into it. I don't know if anybody has any other questions. I think I've gone over my time, probably, but I would recommend reading Camus. He's very good.
There is another connection you could make, and that's with existence.
Okay.
Because in some of in Heidegger and to some extent in Emerson and Thoreau as well, there is the idea that human beings exist, which is to be outside yourself. It's to be ecstasis. Yes, an ecstasy. That's right. Yes. And that fits in with some of what you're saying. It's also that if you take the description on the bus, then in order to know Janine, we need to know what's outside her. You see the way the description is constructed.
Yeah. And we can. There's a danger of maybe dichotomizing those two things, but actually the outside is very much part of her. And I think this is recognition. If we look at it in Hegel, for example, when he talks about recognition, there's this sense of the other and the self being, or Merleau-Ponty, maybe, I can't remember who said it, but yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.